On a freezing January morning in 1944, American soldiers stared up at a mountain that seemed to mock them. Monte Cassino rose, 1,700 feet above the Liri Valley in central Italy, crowned by a massive monastery that had stood for nearly 1,500 years. Between those soldiers and Rome, between the Allied armies and victory in Italy, stood this single mountain and the German defenders who had transformed it into the most formidable defensive position in Europe. Over the next 4 months, that mountain would consume 4 separate offensives involving soldiers from a dozen nations, costing over 55,000 Allied casualties and 20,000 German losses. It would witness some of the most brutal fighting of World War II, reduce an ancient monastery to rubble, and prove that even overwhelming superiority in men and materials could be stopped cold by determined defenders holding ideal terrain. This is the story of Monte Cassino, the mountain that stopped an army. To understand why this single mountain became so critical, you need to understand the strategic situation in Italy in late 1943. The Allies had invaded mainland Italy in September, expecting a rapid advance up the peninsula that would knock Italy out of the war and threaten Germany's southern flank. Instead, they discovered that Italy's mountainous terrain was a defender's paradise. The Italian peninsula is essentially a long spine of mountains, running north to south, cut by rivers that flow east and west to the coasts. An army advancing north had to cross river after river attack, ridge after ridge, with the defenders always holding the high ground and always able to retreat to the next prepared position. The Germans under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring understood this terrain perfectly and had no intention of abandoning Italy without extracting a terrible price. Kesselring established a series of defensive lines across the width of Italy, each one designed to delay the Allied advance and bleed their armies white. The most formidable of these was the Gustav Line, which stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea on the west coast to the Adriatic on the east, roughly 70 miles across some of the most defensible terrain in Europe. The western anchor of the Gustav Line was the Garigliano River. The eastern anchor was the Sangro River. But the absolute center, the point where the Gustav Line was strongest and where it had to be broken if the Allies were to reach Rome, was the Liri Valley and the town of Cassino. And towering over both was Monte Cassino. The mountain's defensive value was almost obscene. It dominated the entire Liri Valley, which was the only practical route for a mechanized army advancing on Rome from the south. Highway 6, the main road to Rome, ran through the valley directly beneath Monte Cassino. Any army trying to use that highway would be under direct observation and fire from the heights. The Rapido River flowing through the valley at the mountain's base provided a water obstacle that would channel attackers into killing zones. The terrain around Cassino was a nightmare of small, steep hills, rock outcroppings and ravines that broke up attacking formations and made coordinated operations nearly impossible. And the Germans had spent months fortifying every inch of this ground. The Gustav Line defences around Monte Cassino were engineering masterpieces that turned natural advantages into man-made death traps. The Germans had blasted machine gun positions into solid rock, creating bunkers that were immune to artillery fire and invisible until they opened fire. They had constructed interlocking fields of fire so that any approach to the mountain could be hit from multiple positions simultaneously. They had pre-registered their artillery on every likely avenue of approach, meaning they could bring down devastating barrages within seconds of spotting movement. They had mined the approaches, extensively strung barbed wire through the rocky terrain, and demolished buildings in the town of Cassino to create rubble fields that channeled attackers into prepared killing zones. The Rapido River, normally a minor obstacle, had been turned into a serious barrier by demolishing bridges and constructing positions that could sweep any crossing attempt with fire. Above all this, on the mountain's summit, stood the monastery of Monte Cassino. Founded by Saint Benedict in 529 AD, it was one of Christianity's most sacred sites, the birthplace of Western monasticism, and a repository of priceless manuscripts and art. The monastery's massive walls were visible for miles, a landmark that dominated the entire battlefield. The Germans had officially declared it a neutral zone and denied placing military positions inside its walls, though they certainly used it as an observation post and had fortified positions immediately around it. For the Allies, the monastery became an obsession, a symbol of the mountain's impregnability, and a source of endless debate about whether military necessity justified destroying such a cultural treasure. The man tasked with breaking through the Gustav Line was General Mark Clark, commander of the US Fifth Army. Clark was ambitious, image-conscious, and determined to be the general who liberated Rome. He was also dealing with an incredibly difficult operational situation. His army was exhausted from months of fighting up the Italian peninsula through terrible weather and murderous terrain. His divisions were under strength, his supply lines were strained, and the approaching winter of 1943-44 was one of the wettest and coldest in Italian memory. The rivers were swollen, the valleys were turning into mud, and his soldiers were operating in conditions that made movement and supply nightmarish. Despite this pressure from above, demanded results. The Allied High Command wanted Rome, wanted it before the cross-channel invasion of France, wanted a victory that would justify the Italian campaign's enormous cost in men and resources. The first attempt to crack the Gustav Line began in January 1944 and focused on crossing the Rapido River in the valley below Monte Cassino. The US 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had already suffered heavily in earlier fighting, was given the mission of forcing a crossing and establishing a bridgehead that would allow armor and follow-on forces to exploit toward the Liri Valley. It was a mission that many officers privately believed was impossible, but orders were orders. On the night of January the 20th, the 36th Division attacked across the Rapido in darkness, carrying assault boats and bridging equipment through muddy fields that German artillery had already ranged with devastating precision. What followed was slaughter. The Germans had perfect observation from Monte Cassino and had prepared for exactly this attack. As American soldiers struggled through mud, carrying their boats, German artillery opened fire with murderous accuracy. The riverbanks were swept by machine gun fire from bunkers that were invisible in the darkness. The assault boats, clumsy and difficult to handle, made easy targets. Many were sunk by artillery before they even reached the water. Others capsized in the swollen river or were caught in barbed wire that the Germans had strung beneath the water's surface. Small groups made it across and tried to establish positions on the far bank, but they were immediately cut off, pinned down by fire from prepared positions, and unable to link up or receive support. The bridging equipment essential for getting tanks and heavy weapons across was destroyed by artillery before it could be deployed. The attack continued through the night and into the next day, with fresh battalions being fed into the assault as earlier waves were destroyed. The 36th Division's commanders could see it was hopeless, but kept attacking because they had been ordered to establish a bridgehead and had not been given permission to withdraw. By the time the operation was finally called off, the division had suffered over 2,000 casualties, roughly 15% of its strength for no gain whatsoever. Not a single permanent foothold had been established across the Rapido. The riverbanks were littered with destroyed boats, abandoned equipment, and American dead. The failed Rapido crossing would become one of the war's most controversial operations, with survivors later demanding a congressional investigation into whether their division had been needlessly sacrificed in an impossible mission. But the failure at the Rapido was only the prelude. While that attack was collapsing, other Allied forces were attempting to advance on different sectors of the Gustav Line. The British X-Corps attacked across the Garigliano River to the west, achieving some initial success, but ultimately being stopped by German counterattacks. The French Expeditionary Corps, composed of colonial troops from North Africa, under General Alphonse Juin, made better progress in the mountains north of Cassino, demonstrating that the Gustav Line could be penetrated given enough determination and skill. But none of these attacks threatened the central position at Monte Cassino itself. The mountain remained in German hands, the Liri Valley remained blocked, and Highway 6 remained impassable. If the Allies were going to break through to Rome, they would have to take that mountain. The First Battle of Monte Cassino, as it would later be called, began in earnest in early February, when the US 34th Infantry Division was ordered to attack the mountain directly. These soldiers faced a nightmare mission advancing up steep rocky slopes in winter weather against an enemy holding prepared positions with perfect fields of fire. The mountain's terrain was so broken and difficult that units quickly lost cohesion, becoming scattered among the ravines and rock outcroppings. Communication was nearly impossible. Supply was a nightmare, with everything having to be carried up on soldiers' backs or on mule trains that were vulnerable to German fire. Casualties couldn't be evacuated easily, so wounded men often had to be carried down the mountain by hand, taking multiple soldiers out of the fight for hours. The 34th Division attacked with incredible courage and determination, slowly fighting their way up the mountain against fanatical German resistance. They took Hill 593, a key position below the monastery, after days of brutal close-quarters combat. They fought for every cave, every bunker, every rock pile. Gains were measured in yards, not miles. German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division elite troops, who had been ordered to hold Monte Cassino at all costs, contested every foot of ground. These weren't ordinary infantry. They were some of Germany's best soldiers, motivated, experienced, and absolutely convinced that they could stop any Allied attack if they held their positions. And the positions were extraordinary. Machine gun nests blasted into solid rock that could only be destroyed by direct hits from heavy weapons. Observation posts on the heights that could call down artillery on any movement. A maze of trenches, bunkers, and strong points that forced attackers to expose themselves to fire from multiple directions simultaneously. By mid-February, the 34th Division had fought itself to exhaustion. They had gained ground, had even reached positions within a few hundred yards of the monastery itself, but they couldn't break through. Their casualties were horrific, approaching 50% in some battalions. The survivors were physically and mentally shattered, living in foxholes on the mountain, in freezing temperatures under constant German artillery fire, unable to advance further, and barely able to hold what they'd taken. The division was withdrawn, having proven that the mountain could be contested, but not that it could be taken. The First Battle of Monte Cassino ended in stalemate, with the Germans still holding the heights and the Allies no closer to opening the Liri Valley. This failure produced one of the war's most controversial decisions, the bombing of Monte Cassino Monastery. Allied commanders, desperate for any advantage, had become convinced that the Germans were using the monastery itself as an observation post and fighting position. Refugees reported seeing German soldiers inside the walls. Forward observers swore they had taken fire from the monastery's direction. The massive structure dominated the battlefield, and as long as it stood, it seemed to mock Allied efforts to take the mountain. General Bernhard Freyberg, the New Zealander commanding the forces preparing for the next assault, demanded that the monastery be destroyed before his troops attacked. He argued that his soldiers believed Germans were inside and wouldn't attack with full determination as long as that belief existed. The military logic was thin. Destroying the monastery would actually create better defensive positions in the rubble. But the psychological pressure was enormous. On February 15th, 1944, over 200 Allied bombers dropped more than 400 tons of high explosives on Monte Cassino Monastery. The ancient building, which had survived barbarian invasions, earthquakes, and 14 centuries of history, was pounded into rubble over the course of several hours. The bombing was observed by journalists, filmed by cameras, and turned into a propaganda victory for the Allies, showing their power and determination. It was also a military disaster and a cultural catastrophe. The Germans, who had mostly stayed out of the monastery to that point, now occupied the ruins and found them to be far better defensive positions than the intact building had been. The massive stone blocks and deep cellars provided perfect cover. The rubble made approaching the site even more difficult, and the destruction of such a sacred site handed the Germans a propaganda victory, allowing them to portray the Allies as barbarians, willing to destroy Western civilization's heritage. The Second Battle of Monte Cassino followed immediately after the bombing, with the 4th Indian Division attacking up the mountain, while New Zealand forces attempted to advance through the town of Cassino in the valley below. Both attacks were based on the assumption that the monastery's destruction would have broken German resistance and opened the way to the summit. Instead, the German paratroopers fought from the rubble with even greater intensity. The Indians made it close to the monastery ruins, but were stopped by concentrated fire and counterattacks. The The New Zealanders fought into Cassino Town and discovered that the Germans had turned the rubble of demolished buildings into an urban fortress. Every pile of debris concealed a machine gun. Every cellar was a bunker. Movement during daylight was impossible due to German snipers and observers on the heights. The attack bogged down in vicious close-quarters fighting among the ruins, with gains measured in buildings rather than streets. The weather, which had been terrible throughout, now turned catastrophic. Torrential rains turned the battlefield into a quagmire. The Rapido River flooded, cutting off units that had advanced into Cassino Town. Supply became nearly impossible. The New Zealand and Indian troops, already exhausted by days of combat, now had to fight in flooded positions while suffering from exposure. German defenders were in hardly better condition, but they were in prepared positions and had the advantage of fighting defensively. After days of grinding combat that achieved nothing except mutual attrition, the second battle was called off. The monastery ruins remained in German hands. The town of Cassino was contested but not taken. The Gustav Line had held again. There was now a pause of several weeks while the Allies regrouped, reinforced, and planned a third attempt. The strategic situation was becoming desperate. The Italian campaign had been supposed to draw German forces away from France and provide a southern route into Germany. Instead, it had become a meat grinder that was consuming Allied divisions while achieving minimal strategic results. The landing at Anzio, which was supposed to outflank the Gustav Line by putting troops ashore behind German positions, had also bogged down and turned into another stalemate. Rome, which had seemed tantalizingly close in the autumn of 1943, remained out of reach. And Monte Cassino continued to dominate the battlefield, its ruins a symbol of Allied frustration and German tenacity. The Third Battle of Monte Cassino was launched on March 15th, with an operation that demonstrated both the desperation and the power the Allies could bring to bear. The battle began with an aerial bombardment that dwarfed the monastery bombing. Over 500 aircraft dropped more than 1,000 tons of bombs on the town of Cassino, attempting to obliterate the German defensive positions through sheer destructive force. It was the heaviest aerial bombardment in support of ground troops that had been attempted to that point in the war. For hours, waves of bombers pounded the already ruined town, turning rubble into dust, collapsing cellars, and creating craters that overlapped across the entire area. Artillery followed with over 700 guns, adding their fire to the devastation. By the time the bombardment lifted, Cassino Town appeared to have been erased from the map. New Zealand and Indian troops attacked into this lunar landscape, expecting to find the German defenders annihilated or at least stunned into submission. Instead, they discovered that the paratroopers had largely survived in deep cellars and bunkers that even 1,000-pound bombs couldn't penetrate. Worse, the bombardment had created conditions that actually favoured the defenders. The cratered, rubble-choked streets were impassable to tanks, meaning infantry had to attack without armour support. The dust thrown up by the bombing reduced visibility to yards, making coordination impossible. German machine gunners emerged from their shelters and resumed firing from positions in the rubble that were nearly invisible. The attack quickly devolved into the same kind of close-quarters nightmare that had characterized the second battle. The fighting in Cassino Town during the third battle reached levels of intensity that veterans compared to the worst of Stalingrad. Individual buildings, or even rooms, would change hands multiple times. German paratroopers would emerge from cellars behind Allied lines to attack from unexpected directions. Tanks that managed to navigate the rubble-choked streets were destroyed by German engineers emerging from hiding with explosive charges. The New Zealanders captured Castle Hill, a key position overlooking the town, only to be subjected to immediate counterattacks supported by armour that the Germans had somehow managed to move into position despite Allied air superiority. Progress was measured in buildings, and those gains were temporary, as German counterattacks constantly pushed Allied forces back. On the mountain itself, the Indians renewed their attacks toward the monastery ruins, fighting over the same ground the 34th Division had contested in February. They made some gains, reaching positions very close to the ruins, but couldn't achieve a breakthrough. The German defense was simply too strong, too well coordinated, and too deeply committed to holding every position to the last man. After 5 days of continuous combat with casualty lists growing and gains remaining minimal, the third battle was called off. Monte Cassino had held again. 3 separate major offensives had been launched against the Gustav Line in the first 3 months of 1944. All 3 had failed. The mountain remained in German hands, the Liri Valley remained blocked, and the road to Rome remained closed. The pause that followed the third battle was longer driven by necessity and by a recognition that a completely different approach was needed. Simply launching another frontal assault against Monte Cassino with the same tactics would produce the same results. What was needed was overwhelming force-perfect coordination and a plan that would crack the entire Gustav Line, rather than just battering at its strongest point. General Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied forces in Italy, spent April and early May assembling the strongest force yet committed to the Italian campaign. Over 20 divisions representing American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, Indian, New Zealand, and other nationalities were concentrated opposite the Gustav Line. This was a truly international army, and it would be committed in a coordinated offensive across the entire front, rather than in isolated attacks. The plan for the fourth battle was more sophisticated than anything attempted previously. The French Expeditionary Corps would attack in the mountains to the west of the Liri Valley, attempting to outflank the German positions through terrain the Germans considered impassable. The British 13th Corps would cross the Garigliano River and advance up the coast. The Polish II Corps would attack Monte Cassino directly from the north, accepting the mission of taking the monastery ruins. And most critically, once these attacks had drawn German reserves, the Canadian Pice Corps would smash through the Gustav Line in the Liri Valley itself, breaking into the open ground beyond where Allied armour could finally operate freely. It was an orchestrated offensive on a scale that Italy had not yet seen, and it would be supported by massive artillery and air support. The offensive began on the night of May 11, 1944, with an artillery barrage that was unprecedented in the Italian campaign. Over 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously along the entire Gustav Line, pounding German positions with a concentration of firepower that soldiers on both sides remembered as apocalyptic. The initial attacks achieved surprise and made significant gains. The French, attacking through mountains the Germans had considered impassable, broke through the Gustav Line defences in their sector and began advancing toward the Hitler Line, the next German defensive position to the rear. British forces crossed the Garigliano and established bridgeheads. All along the line, the German defences, which had held for so long, began to crack under the weight of coordinated attacks, hitting them simultaneously. But Monte Cassino itself remained the hardest nut to crack. The Polish II Corps, given the dubious honour of attacking the mountain, directly launched their assault with extraordinary courage and suffered appalling casualties. The Polish troops, many of whom were veterans who had been fighting since 1939 and had scores to settle with Germany, attacked with determination that bordered on fanaticism. They fought their way up the same slopes that had consumed American, British, Indian, and New Zealand troops in earlier battles. They took German positions at bayonet point, captured bunkers that had held for months, and pushed toward the monastery ruins despite casualties that quickly climbed above 30%. The German paratroopers, now desperately outnumbered and running low on supplies, as other sectors of the Gustav Line collapsed, continued to fight with their characteristic ferocity. For several days, the outcome on Monte Cassino itself remained in doubt, even as the broader offensive succeeded elsewhere. The French breakthrough in the mountains threatened to encircle the entire German position. British forces were advancing up the coast. In the Liri Valley, after several days of brutal fighting, the Canadians and British finally broke through the Gustav Line defences and began exploiting toward the Hitler Line. The German position at Monte Cassino was becoming untenable, not because the Poles had defeated the paratroopers holding it, but because the entire defensive line was collapsing and the mountain was in danger of being cut off. On May 17th, the surviving German defenders withdrew from Monte Cassino under cover of darkness, finally abandoning the position they had held for 4 months against repeated Allied offensives. On the morning of May 18th, Polish soldiers entered the ruins of Monte Cassino Monastery and raised the Polish flag over the rubble. The photograph of that moment showing the white and red Polish banner flying above the devastated monastery, became iconic. The mountain that had stopped an army had finally been taken, but not through direct assault so much as through the collapse of the entire defensive system it anchored. The cost had been extraordinary. The Poles alone suffered over 4,000 casualties taking the mountain. Total Allied casualties in the 4 battles of Monte Cassino exceeded 55,000 killed, wounded and missing. German casualties were around 20,000, a testimony to the defensive advantage conferred by terrain and preparation. With Monte Cassino finally in Allied hands, and the Gustav Line broken, the way to Rome was open. The advance that followed was everything the earlier attacks had tried to achieve. Allied armour poured through the Liri Valley, exploiting the breakthrough and forcing the Germans into retreat. The Hitler Line, which might have held for weeks if attacked frontally, was outflanked and penetrated within days. German forces fell back toward Rome in fighting retreat, trying to delay rather than stop the Allied advance. On June 4, 1944, American forces entered Rome, achieving the objective that had seemed so tantalizingly close since the previous autumn. General Mark Clark got his moment of glory posing for photographers in front of Roman landmarks, the liberating hero he had always wanted to be. 2 days later, the Allied invasion of Normandy launched, and the liberation of Rome was immediately pushed off the front pages. Italy and Monte Cassino became secondary theatres almost overnight. The strategic impact of Monte Cassino remains debated. The 4-month struggle consumed enormous resources, caused horrific casualties, and delayed the Allied advance up Italy by months. It tied down German divisions that might have been used in France, which was part of the strategic justification for the Italian campaign, but it also tied down Allied divisions that could have been used elsewhere. The decision to fight for Monte Cassino, rather than finding some way to bypass or outflank it, consumed some of the war's finest troops in a grinding battle of attrition that favoured the defenders. The destruction of the monastery, meanwhile, remains one of the war's most controversial cultural losses, a decision that provided no military advantage and destroyed a priceless piece of human heritage. But the tactical lessons of Monte Cassino were undeniable and would influence military thinking for decades. The campaign demonstrated that even overwhelming superiority in men, materials and firepower could be negated by defenders holding ideal terrain with proper preparation. It showed the limitations of strategic bombing when used against tactical targets, with hundreds of bombers unable to eliminate defenders in prepared positions. It proved that infantry would remain decisive in mountain warfare, despite all of modern technology's advantages, and it demonstrated the extraordinary tenacity and courage that soldiers on both sides would display when fighting for position they believed was critical. For the soldiers who fought there, Monte Cassino was an experience that defined their war. The American 36th Division never forgave the commanders who ordered them across the Rapido. The Polish II Corps made the capture of Monte Cassino a central part of their identity, with their soldiers eventually buried in a cemetery on the mountain they had taken at such cost. The German paratroopers who defended the mountain became legendary within the Wehrmacht, living symbols of the German soldiers' fighting quality. The New Zealanders and Indians who fought in Cassino Town and on the mountain's slopes remembered it as some of the war's most brutal combat, and the monastery itself, eventually rebuilt after the war to match its original appearance, remains a memorial to the thousands who died fighting for the mountain that once stopped an army. The ruins of fortifications can still be found on Monte Cassino today, bunkers and trenches hidden among the trees and rock that have reclaimed the battlefield. The Polish cemetery, immaculately maintained, holds the graves of over 1,000 Polish soldiers who died taking the mountain. The monastery has been reconstructed and is once again a functioning abbey, but the mountain itself remembers. Every rock, every slope, every foot of ground that took so many lives and consumed so many offensives bears silent witness to those desperate months in 1944, when Monte Cassino became the centre of the world, when victory and defeat, strategy and courage met on its slopes, and when it became the mountain that stopped an army, until an army, finally at terrible cost, refused to be stopped any longer.